Fine. So thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak on behalf of British in Europe. I'm also very happy to be speaking with our friends, with Cuba from the 3 Million. We've worked really closely on advocacy with the 3 Million throughout the last 3 or so years on citizens' rights since 2017. And also pleased to be speaking with Tanja Bultmann. I've lobbied with her in the Bundestag here in Germany, because this is a citizens' rights issue for all of us, not about one group or the other. Today, what I would like to do is get across some key messages from British in Europe on British citizens in the EU and the implementation of the Withdrawal Agreement. And I would also like to give a very brief snapshot of what's going on the ground. That's going to be quite difficult because obviously I've got to cover 26 countries. Ireland's a slightly different situation. And I'll also look a little bit at how the COVID crisis is impacting UK citizens in the EU and the implementation of the Withdrawal Agreement. And finally, I'll wrap up with 5 asks to you in the EU-UK Friendship Group and to other MEPs in the European Parliament. But before I do that, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. There are 4 things that you need to know about British in Europe. The first is that there are around 1.2 to 1.3 million of us. Nearly 80% of us are working age or younger, and the younger group often gets overlooked. We're also actually a pan-European movement because we have groups in almost every EU country at the moment of British citizens. And we are all still Europeans. Many of us remain EU citizens, or we're family members of EU citizens. So we are still your constituents, MEPs in the European Parliament. So I'd like to start with my key messages. And if there's one thing that you might take away from the webinar today about UK citizens in the EU, and that is that our feeling is that not enough attention is being paid to how the rights of UK citizens in the EU are being implemented. It was very interesting to hear about the survey from Tanja concerning EU citizens in the UK and what Cuba has talked about concrete application of the Withdrawal Agreement in the UK. UK's settled status no doubt has many problems, but it is up and running. In contrast, few EU countries have actually started implementing the Withdrawal Agreement for UK citizens. And the clock is ticking. There's 8 months until the end of transition, and then 14 months until the grace period for registration, and this is the deadline that Cuba was referring to, finishes in June 2021. And that's particularly important in countries which have an application or constitutive system. And why does that matter, the timing? It is because EU countries like the UK had a choice as to what system they could apply, either a declaratory system or a simple registration system, or an application or constitutive system. Most UK citizens in the EU are actually already registered in the countries where they live. France is an exception to this, where registration wasn't compulsory. Nevertheless, around half of EU countries have actually decided to go for an application or constitutive system, which means, in principle, unless the deadline is extended, that a citizen would have no legal status unless they successfully apply for the status by June 2021. So it's very similar to the situation in the UK as far as the constitutive countries are concerned. We also have no idea at the moment, because very little implementation is going on so far, how countries will apply Withdrawal Agreement conditions, which mirror those for showing that you're exercising free movement rights. There are countries, EU countries, that currently don't apply those conditions very strictly for EU citizens. But because we don't know how the withdrawal agreement will be implemented for UK citizens in the EU, we don't know yet whether those requirements will be applied more strictly to UK citizens under the withdrawal agreement, even if they are already permanent residents, people who have 5+ years continuous residence, exercising free movement rights in the country where they live. Another really important message today to take with you is that the withdrawal agreement doesn't cover all of our current rights. The majority of our rights are covered in the country where we live, the host country. However, free movement rights, cross-border movement, cross-border working rights, and EU-wide recognition of qualifications, for example, are not covered. In fact, I should mention that other third country nationals who have applied and successfully received and obtained EU long-term residents actually will have more mobility rights than UK citizens in the EU will have under the withdrawal agreement. And that's because with mobility rights are not covered under the withdrawal agreement. So that means a British citizen with permanent residence will have fewer rights than another third country national with an equivalent status. This will affect younger groups disproportionately who are very mobile, but in fact it will affect very many of our members because we're a very mobile population, and free movement is what we've run surveys on this among our members. Free movement is a key right for our members. It's also unclear whether the status that we have under the withdrawal agreement can be cumulated with other statuses, for example, EU long-term residence, which would give us some mobility rights, or applying for an EU blue card, or as the family member of an EU citizen or spouse or partner. So the question is, do we have to choose between these statuses, although we would lose rights? These are very complex questions that need to be answered in the European Commission's guidance note on the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement, and which has not yet been published. Another big question, what happens to dual nationals? Many people have taken dual citizenship post the EU referendum. That's another issue for the guidance note. Dual citizens and others who rely on the withdrawal agreement but not for residence rights will not be issued with a residence card to document their rights. So, for example, as a dual British-German citizen, if my qualifications are British, I can't work if I can't prove my right under the withdrawal agreement to continuing recognition of my qualifications. Then there are others, including dual citizens, who also need to be able to document their social security rights under the withdrawal agreement. Again, they won't have a residence card to do that. Finally, coming on to the documents that we will receive. The good news is that we, UK citizens in the EU, will receive a physical document. However, there are still problems with the standard residence document that UK citizens are expected to be given once they apply or register for their status. We welcome the EC implementing the decision to provide for a standard form document, but the problem with the document is that it does not distinguish between permanent and ordinary residence. And this is really important because permanent residence is a fundamental status guaranteed by the withdrawal agreement after 5 years residence. And with permanent residence, you can be absent from your country, host country, for up to 5 years, whereas without it, we would risk losing all rights if we're away from our host country for 6 months. The other benefit of having proof of permanent residence is that you have the right to remain without having to prove on an ongoing basis that you are exercising free movement rights. And in Italy, for example, the non-economically active actually need a permanent residence card in order to access the health service on the same terms as Italians. So the EU card is intended to evidence our rights, but what use is it if it does not evidence this most fundamental right of permanent residence? wanted to go on after this, to give you a bit of a snapshot of what's happening on the ground across the EU. This, obviously, it's 26 countries, so it really will have to be a snapshot. As I said, in most member states, we can only anticipate potential problems because implementation has not started. And this includes 3 of the countries with the largest populations of British citizens: Spain, France, and Germany. We know that 4 countries already have adopted their legislation or provisions on the future system, and are already starting to implement that. Those countries are Italy, the Netherlands, Malta, and Cyprus. Moreover, there are a few countries in which legislation or some form of implementing provision has actually been adopted. Again, this is understandable due to the current COVID-19 crisis, and also because of the focus on no deal last year. But we do hope that this will change going into the summer. So Spain and France have not yet put out draft legislation or adopted legislation. Germany just adopted its draft legislation at the end of March. In many countries, also with smaller countries, there is no legislation yet. And I can see that Terry already has her video up. So that means that I had better be very quick with the rest of my overview of 26 countries. So just to finish that up, if I just want to say something about the crisis, the majority of our groups, therefore, are unable to let us know what the timetable is for adoption and implementation, although not before, in no country does it seem to be before the summer or autumn, and in some countries it would be as late as next year, 2021. And it also means that when we spoke to our groups, it was not possible for them to tell us how strictly the country where they were living in was likely to apply the conditions under the withdrawal agreement. I just wanted to say something very quickly about how the crisis is impacting UK citizens in the EU and withdrawal agreement implementation. We're worried about the financial aspects of this and how this will impact people's ability to comply with the conditions. We're also worried about how it might affect young people, particularly if they're studying in another country and they can't get back to their country. We're worried about people who've got stuck in other countries and won't be able to get back to their host country to fulfill all the necessary bureaucratic conditions. And there will inevitably be backlogs as well. So the final thing I want to say before I stop speaking is we have 5 asks to the European Parliament. So the first is, yet again, we would like to ask you to push for the EU to confirm our continuing free movement rights and our rights to work across borders. Because, as I've said, we don't even have the same mobility rights as third country nationals who have the equivalent status of EU long-term residents under the withdrawal agreement. The second thing is I want to second Cuba's request to support our ask to be in the room at the specialized as expert observers in the specialized committee for citizens' rights under the withdrawal agreement. We also ask you to support our request to the EC to amend the implementing decision on standard cards to show the distinction between permanent and ordinary residents. And then we would like to ask your governments to make a clear statement to UK citizens in their countries that they will take a generous approach, particularly in constitutive countries, in applying the conditions of the withdrawal agreement, and especially in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Many thanks. I hope I haven't gone over my time too much, Terry.